Well, I feel fortunate to have grabbed some of your time. Andy Biggs from American Enterprise Institute. I appreciate you coming on to talk to us. Nothing but Social Security in the news recently, and you know more than anyone else. So thank you for taking the time.
So that's why I'm so cheerful. The more you know
That's
about
right.
Social Security, the happier you are. But thanks for having me, Susan. No,
I mean,
it
hey
has been
man,
busier. I'm really happy to be with you today.
I'm in my 60s. I see something about Social Security running out of money. I pay attention. So just to bring us all up to speed, in the last week, there was a news flash that Social Security is going to run out of money sooner. What does it really mean?
Yeah, every year the Social Security trustees, which is mostly members of the cabinet, a secretary of the treasury, Social Security commissioner, et cetera, they come out with a report where they project the program's financial health, both in the short term and the long term. And, that happens every year. It's been getting worse every year. And in this year's report, they projected that the retirement trust fund will go insolvent or run out of money in 2032, and they also projected a significantly longer or significantly larger sort of funding gap in the years thereafter. And this is worth explaining. When the trust fund runs out, it doesn't mean that there's zero money to pay benefits. As long as we're paying $1 trillion a year in payroll taxes, there will be that money to pay benefits. But when the trust fund runs out, it means benefits will be cut. And I think their projection is somewhere about 22%. The size of that long-term funding gap dictates, how big the cuts are going to be in the years thereafter. So, the trustees lowered their projections for birth rates. They found that the One Big Beautiful Bill has worsened Social Security's finances. So, a variety of things made this long-term funding gap worse. So it's really hard to paint a happy picture from that. I mean, the trust funds can be running out in about 6 years, and the funding gap and the benefit cuts or whatever in years thereafter are going to be larger. So it's a sobering picture.
I'm not trying to pile on or anything, but I think I saw that they extended the time when they expect birth rates to bounce back. Is that true? Because I have not seen anything anywhere, and I've spoken to some demographers to suggest birth rates are ever going to bounce back.
Yeah, this is here's the interesting thing. The If you look at, say, the Congressional Budget Office or the U.S. Census Bureau, right now the birth rate, the fertility rate is about 1.6 children per woman on average. And both the CBO and the census project that's going to remain pretty much steady, declining a little bit over coming decades. Social Security had a very different picture. As of last year, they thought that the birth rate, which is 1.6 now, is immediately going to start rising and go back up to 1.9 children per woman, in the next several decades. And that makes Social Security's finances better. So you got more kids being born, more people paying into the system. Now, what they did in this year's report is the trustees moderated a bit on fertility. They said, okay, it's not going to rise back to 1.9, it'll rise back to 1.75. So they're still over optimistic. I mean, I
Okay.
don't, I've talked to some demographers and economists who really focused on the birth rate stuff, and they described the trustees' assumptions as the quote was fanciful, meaning they just weren't plausible. Now they're somewhat more plausible now, but the thing is, they still tend to be more optimistic than other agencies. And to be frank, this is a concern of mine, where you really want the people who are sort of the scorekeepers, the umpires, to really be playing it as straight as they possibly can. We know that these guesses they're making are going to be wrong because this stuff is impossible to predict with certainty. But most demographers, people are looking at birth rates, think, the best guess is we'll stay around 1.6 going forward. You've seen a decline. You've also, a good predictor of birth rates is sort of religiosity, the level of religious belief in a country. And the US is typically been much more religious than Western Europe, and that's played into fertility. There's been a big decline in religious belief, particularly among younger Americans, along with all the other pessimism you see among younger kids. And when people are pessimistic, they tend not to have a lot of kids. And so the best guess is we're to stay about where we are. So, I mean, I wrote something the other day and saying, the The bad news this trustees report is even though it's worse than last year's, it could have been even worse. Plausibly, they project a long-term funding gap about 4.4% of payroll. What that means is we took that 12.4% payroll tax today and raised it immediately and permanently by 4.4 percentage points. So 12.4 to 16.8. That would, in theory, keep the trust fund solvent for 75 years. And let's, forget about what you think about the trust fund, but that's the math of it. I think something, a better guess would be instead of 4.4% gap, 4.8, closer to 5%. This is real money. I mean, for years and years and years, I've been working on Social Security. Your line from people on the sort of the left is, well, okay, we know Social Security's got a solvency problem, but it's a manageable issue. Look, they were saying that when the funding gap was 2% of payroll. I'm like, all right, fine. But now you're looking at 4 to 5% of payroll. That's a lot of money. And at a time when a lot of other things are making claims on the budget. And we've got some difficult choices to make, and we really have to start thinking hard about this stuff.
Okay, so what about this idea that's been floated in the last week of getting rid of the payroll cap?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, first of all, explain the payroll cap, please, and then
Sure.
this idea of getting rid of it.
Now, Social Security, you have a 12.4% payroll tax. Half paid by you, half paid by your employer. That applies only up to wages up to $184,500. That's called the payroll tax ceiling or the tax max. That dollar figure goes up every year, but this year is 184,000. So the thing is, you only pay taxes on those wages. You also earn benefits only on those wages. So people say, "Well, Bill Gates doesn't pay, more taxes than that. He doesn't earn any benefits either." So you're capping both the taxes and the benefits. And a thing, you know, just to fast forward a little bit, there's an op-ed in the Washington Post this week from was Senator Bernie Moreno, who's a Republican from Ohio, and Elizabeth Warren is Democrat from Massachusetts. They say, oh, it's just common sense, just eliminate that cap and tax all earnings for Social Security. The interesting thing is how uncommon that would be. Our payroll tax ceiling is $184,000. Almost every other country has a ceiling on their payroll taxes for their pension system. In almost every other country, the ceiling is lower. It's in Canada, they're called Canada pension plans, kind of like Social Security. You only pay taxes and earn benefits up to around $60,000 in earnings there. With UK, it's about $70,000. Germany, it's about $70,000. We are an outlier for how high up the ladder we tax people, and it's so to eliminate it entirely is a big deal. It's effectively a 12 percentage point increase in the top marginal tax rate. So let's say, I mean, I pulled an example of somebody living in New York City because you've got federal income taxes, a higher income person be 37% on that. You'd have the regular Medicare taxes, additional Medicare tax they get hit with. You'd have state taxes, you'd have city taxes. If you add another 12 percentage points of that, their marginal tax rate's in the mid 60s. And that's before we fixed Medicare, done anything else. The federal budget's still broke, and
Right, right.
you have taxed these guys as high as you possibly can. And so these things that look like common sense, why don't we tax everybody? Look, there's reasons for that. And
And were
so
they suggesting if I make 300,000 and I pay my 6.2, totals 12.4 and my entire salary, that then my Social Security benefit one day will be $10,000? Like, are they talking about capping the benefit or just capping, I'm sorry, getting rid of the cap on benefits or just getting rid of the cap
they
on
have
the payroll?
not there's
Didn't
a
say
sort of a
anything else.
policy problem here.
Yeah.
They have not been very specific. They say Social Security would continue to be an earned benefit. What that kind of implies is that you would continue to earn benefits on the additional taxes you would pay. Let's say if we uncap the payroll tax and we, base your taxes on your total earnings, well, you'd also base your benefits on your total earnings. And what you get then is, okay, you're getting all this money from people in the short term, but you're going to pay them higher benefits in the long term. And so that offsets some of the savings. And the interesting thing, just this morning, I was running some numbers and looking back to the 1970s, we had a huge run up in the benefit levels from Social Security in the 1970s. And the benefit formula we have today is not the one FDR invented. It really happened in the 1970s, where they jacked up benefits in a really foolish way, and then to help pay for it, they increased the payroll tax ceiling, so you pay taxes on more of your earnings. Right now it's the payroll tax ceiling is $180,000. If we had just kept the tax max we had in 1970, you index it to wages and keep it going up, it would have been only 95,000. So they essentially doubled the wages that you pay Social Security taxes on. But what happens, they also double the wages that people earn benefits on. So,
Mhm.
I've kind of highlighted a point that if you have a high income couple retiring today, they could get almost $100,000 in total benefits, which is absurd. There's no reason why a government program should be paying anybody that amount. If you want that kind of income in retirement, you save more in your 401k. It's better for you, better for the economy. But it was a result of this short-term step they did in the 70s. They're
Okay.
like, "Hey, we raised benefits too high. Let's jack up the tax max." And they didn't worry, okay, in the future, you have to pay benefits on that. Well, guess what? The future's today. Now we're broke again. We need extra money again. So these guys said, let's just jack up the tax max. I'm like, okay, you got then you'll pay extra benefits in the future. It becomes this chasing your tail kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the problem when you do it is, I mean, there's no country on earth that is paying $100,000 a year, from a social insurance program except for us.
I was gonna
And
say
the
we
reason we did it for these stupid reasons. I mean, if you've got this high income couple in the US retiring today, they can get almost $100,000 from Social Security. If they lived in Canada, they'd get like $35,000. And that's perfectly fine. Nobody's starving to death in Canada in retirement. They just save more on their own. It's the irony is that we think of ourselves as free market, small government country. Our Social Security program is freaking huge, and primarily because we're paying benefits to people that other countries like, yeah, we don't need to pay benefits to these guys, and
and
you know
yet
the
people say, "I put my money in.
yeah,
I
oh,
should
well,
get
and
my
this is
money in."
again, it is the problem is, and I understand, when I say, look, we shouldn't be paying $100,000 a year to a high income couple. You get the email saying, well, I paid in, and I get it. And if you pay in, you feel you have this moral claim on benefits and all that. The problem is Social Security is still broke, so we still need higher taxes or lower benefits. And so the idea I'm just going to get my full benefits with the taxes I paid doesn't work because the system can't afford to do it. So then you have to make the choice of, do I want to pay higher taxes or get lower benefits? I've got to pick my poison. Most high income people would prefer to get lower benefits. They care more about their taxes than they do about their benefits. But it's just people still living in this dream world of this system, which is $30 trillion of the whole, is somehow going to pay me everything I've been promised and then just screw somebody else.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks they're the guy who's going to get everything and somebody else is going to get screwed.
I definitely hear people saying today, like, "Maybe I should go ahead and take it, and then I'll get grandfathered in and my benefits won't get lower."
It probably won't make a difference in the sense that, I mean, I can think of some possibilities, but in general, the way Social Security, I mean, the Social Security benefit formula works based on kind of your birth cohort, the year
Right.
in which you're born, not really the year in which you claim benefits. So what would tend to happen, and people who are going to do Social Security reform understand this stuff, they understand the incentives. They don't want to make it easy for people to kind of game the system. So Social Security reform will probably try to work itself out in such a way that you can't get some big advantage by claiming early. I mean, I could think of some conceivable possibilities, but I still would not encourage people to claim early.
Okay, I want to talk about two more things that I read in the last week. One was a letter from Tim Kaine about his idea with, I believe, Senator Cassidy. Is that right? Cassidy-Kaine?
Yes.
And what's that idea for fixing it? Because there's a lot
We
of
have
ideas floating around out there.
the interesting thing is, and this is a macro point of people say, well, Social Security reform, we have to make it bipartisan. And so, we have these
Third
two
rail.
bipartisan ideas with Moreno and Elizabeth Warren, Republican and Democrat. They've got one idea, eliminating the tax payroll tax ceiling. Cassidy, who is a Republican from Louisiana, and Tim Kaine, a Democrat from Virginia, they've got a bipartisan plan. And guess what? Their plan is also terrible. So it's if there's any if there's any lesson from this,
Bipartisanly terrible.
yeah, it's not. I mean, look, we're going to have to the way politics work, the way the political system works is ultimately Social Security reform is going to have to be bipartisan. On the other hand, there is some lesson. If you've got something both Republicans and Democrats can agree upon, it might be a terrible idea. And with Cassidy and Kane, they are explicitly, and Cassie said this, they're solving a political problem. And the political problem is that neither Republicans or Democrats want to vote for either tax increases or benefit cuts. You think Democrats, they want to raise your taxes. Republicans, they want to cut your benefits. The real reality is they don't want to do either of those things because they realize that either of them are politically unpopular, which is, why we've gone 40 years literally doing nothing. So their solution is so we don't have to make these difficult votes. Instead, the federal government will borrow about $2 trillion. It
Oh,
will then invest that money in stocks and like
right, yeah.
private equity, stuff that's
Mhm.
high risk, high return. And then they claim they're going to take this fund and they're going to hold it for 75 years so it can build up value. In the meantime, when Social Security, the trust fund runs out, 2032, they need extra money. The federal government will borrow against the assumed gains on this investment fund. And they say the borrowing, because this federal government, that'll be the lower rate. And then they say, well, after 75 years, all the gains of this investment fund will pay back all the borrowing, we're all good. And it's like, let me count the ways there are the problems
Talk
with
about
this.
kicking the can.
Well, it's if you do work at the state level. And like state-based think tanks almost know more about this than federal people. A lot of underfunded state pension systems do things. They issue things called pension obligation bonds. Their pension systems underfunded. The public employee plan. They don't want to raise contributions. They don't want to cut benefits. So let's borrow, invest in the stock market, and hope that works. Now, it's the pension obligation bond is the hallmark of poorly funded, poorly run pension system. Your New Jersey's, your Illinois, things like
Yeah.
that. There's a national group of the state budget officers. I'm pulling a blank on it, but yeah, they've come out and basically said as an institution, don't do this. This borrowing for your pension is a bad idea. So it really is fitting for the times that the Cassidy and Kane plan says, let's take this worst idea from state local government employee pensions, which has been condemned as just bad practice, and let's put it on steroids and do that for
Blow it
Social
up.
Security. But what it really gets to is, and partly they just don't understand the finances of it. And to be frank, they won't listen. I mean, they have talked to every pension expert I know, and this pension Social Security world is pretty small. We all know each other on both sides. We may not agree on everything. Literally every pension expert I know says this is a freaking terrible idea. Yeah. But they just won't listen. So then, it's their political considerations are more important than policy stuff. And
Sure.
that's
I
the
mean, it
problem.
feels free. They're basically saying, it's like a timeshare. It's just feeling free to me right now.
Yeah, it's
We
been
borrow the
pointed out to
money.
them,
Yeah. Okay,
if
so
you can fund Social Security this way, you could fund the entire federal government this way. We'd never have to
sure.
pay any taxes. At one point, Senator Cassidy was quoted in a newspaper article saying, well, yeah, sure, in theory you could. I'm like, if something implies there's a free money machine, maybe you need to question your assumptions. And,
Yeah.
I could give you a whole variety of reasons why this whole thing doesn't work. But one of those, again, a macro point that's come to me. I mean, I've been doing Social Security for a long time. I worked in the Bush administration in 2005 when they tried and failed to do Social Security reform. I was doing it even before then. One of the problems we face today is your elected officials understand Social Security policy much less well than they did 20 years ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
they don't understand how the system works. They don't understand it's for these economic issues. The idea, say, going back to this Moreno-Warren idea, well, let's just apply the payroll tax to all earnings. You know, okay, you're adding 12 percentage points, your top tax rate. There's a reason why Sweden and France or whoever don't do this anymore. They used to have these incredibly high tax rates. They don't now. we would end up in a lot of cases the higher tax rate than most European countries. And so we have some philosophical dedication to small government and things like that. They don't.
Mm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
so if they're not doing it, it's because there's a practical reason this isn't a good idea. It's the same on like wealth taxes that people want. Well, yeah, it's been tried in Europe. They're like, yeah, we're not doing that anymore because it doesn't work. But it's your average
It is
senator
happening
now.
around the country these days, the billionaire tax.
Sure, but they're just not aware of these policy issues. And that's a real problem. It's like having a guy to fix your car who doesn't know how to fix cars.
What happens in 2032 if no one is, either brave enough or smart enough to take this on in the next 6 years? What happens in probably more like 2030, but 2032, let's say?
Yeah, 2032 is the date. If you have a recession, it'll be
Yeah.
31 or something like that. So it's not certain, but it is certain it's happening soon. Okay, there's a literal reading of the law, which is, Social Security can't pay out benefits that it doesn't have dedicated resources for. Once the trust fund runs out, the only dedicated resources are mostly the payroll tax, plus they get a little bit of money from income taxes that are levied on retirement benefits. And those were cut as part of the one big, beautiful bill. So if the trust fund runs out, then they'd have to rely on the money they have on hand. That implies this like 22% benefit cut. A lot of times people assume that benefit cut has to be across the board. If you did it that way, that's a big deal. You're going to throw a lot of people into poverty. I did some work a year or so ago with a woman named Kristen Shapiro, who's a lawyer in DC. And what we found is the legal precedent is if the trust fund literally ran out of money, the executive branch, meaning the president working through the Social Security Commissioner, would have some discretion. And what we found is you could maintain full benefits for about 50% of people, the poorest 50% of seniors, then just cap benefits over that. So if you capped the maximum benefit about $24,000 per year for single, 48,000 for couple, to be honest, that is enough to make Social Security solvent without raising taxes. So the point is simply you have some discretion. The reality is Congress isn't going to allow big benefit cuts, again, for political reasons. On the other hand, are they willing to have the size of tax increases, all in one go to keep Social Security paying full benefits? I don't think they want that either. So the reality is probably they're going to borrow a lot of the money. And that's where you get to the issue of how much more borrowing will the financial markets swallow? And they're swallowing it now. We effectively borrow from the public to repay the Social Security Trust Fund. But there's this end to that. You say, okay, 2032, we have to do something. We have to raise taxes or cut benefits. If in 2032, the stated policy of the federal government is, well, we're just going to keep borrowing this money to pay Social Security, even though we have no prospect of paying it back, you wouldn't blame some, big market player like, yeah, I'm out now. Because that's the point. You don't want to lend money, certainly at low interest rates, to a guy who says I can't pay it back.
Right.
So then you start getting, there's a couple things that go on. One is more federal borrowing squeezes out capital and the rest of the economy. And so interest rates naturally rise from that. But then there's a second element of if you're afraid the federal government can't pay you back, then over and above that natural increase in the interest rate, you'd apply a risk premium to the
US
to the
government bond.
treasury debt. You'd
Yeah, yeah,
say,
yeah.
look, treasury is not this rock solid investment anymore. It's more, like a junk bond or something like that. Or, it's like not borrowing from Switzerland is like borrowing from Illinois or something. You make them pay a premium. Again, that's going to drive up interest rates. That makes it tougher, not just for the federal government, although it does, because then their costs just go up even more. But it becomes a problem for everybody. If you want to buy a car, you want to buy a house, all your interest rates rise. Probably there's going to be a real temptation to inflate away the debt. The federal government doesn't want to default on its debt.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you look away, historically, the way you deal with this inflation, think about all the debt we took on during COVID. We're, shoveling money out the door to everybody.
Absolutely.
Like, hey, that's terrible with this massive inflation after it. So really, a lot of those people bought that treasury debt
Yeah.
kind of didn't get a good deal because you get 20% inflation on a a treasury bond that's got a nominal fixed interest rate,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
a real problem. So inflation becomes increasingly tempting. This is just not. You look at the scenario and you're like, can't anybody here play this game? I mean, it's
So what could we
not
like
every country is going bankrupt. We just got to
yeah.
do what they do.
So we could, if we really got our heads around it and started today or next year, we could incrementally raise the 12.4, right?
Sure.
Or
I
we
mean,
could
there's a lot of ways.
incrementally get people used to lower benefits
Yes.
after a certain income or wealth level.
The way I think about it, okay, there's two ways people think about it, and there's the wrong way and there's my way. I mean, the wrong way is, it's I hate to say it, but it's just like, let's just pick from this menu of items or
Yes.
options to make Social Security solvent. Okay, we can raise the payroll tax a bit. We can raise retirement age a bit. We can
Yeah.
cut cost of living adjustments a bit. We can raise the tax cap a bit. And we do these things until the system is solvent. And it'll get you through. You'll have a solvent program, but you won't have a program that particularly works very well. You won't have a program that's good for the economy. A more effective way of doing it is saying, what do we want this system to do? And if you talk about Social Security reform, what you hear is that's a social insurance program, it's a safety net, it's anti-poverty program. Okay, it has to do that. And that part is really very cheap because we don't literally have that many poor seniors. Their benefits aren't very high. It's not a problem to maintain benefits for low income seniors. When you ask what Social Security should do, nobody is saying, "Well, we need to be paying high income seniors $100,000 a year." There's no public purpose for it. Nobody thought it out in advance. It was simply this unintended consequence. So if you have things which are really costing a lot of money, which it is, and which have no public purpose. Those people can save for retirement on their own. You start scaling that back down, and the distinction I'm making is people talking about policy changes simply for the purposes of keeping Social Security solvent and policy changes for the purpose of making Social Security do what it needs to do, the real public purpose, and not do things that aren't public purpose. My point is the things I'm talking about are things you should do whether Social Security is insolvent or not. And if you focus on that, then life becomes much easier. And I'll just give you an example of the retirement system of Australia. Australia's a lot like us. They're not, more conservative, more liberal than us. They're just sort of, kind of normal. And their Social Security program essentially is targeted at eliminating poverty in old age. It's a better safety net than Social Security provides. But the benefits decline actually down to zero once you get above poverty. And to help people above that level save for retirement, everybody is given a 401k, everybody's enrolled in the 401k. So what that says is, look, if everybody's participating in retirement plans, saving as they should, the government's job becomes easier. And so their Social Security system costs about 2% of GDP. Social Security here costs about 6%. It's a
Hmm.
third as costly, provides a better safety net, but it comes because they're thinking about what they're doing. We're literally not thinking about what we're doing. There's a saying, business people use it. They say the worst reason to do something is because we're already doing it. That is literally, in fact, how the Social Security policy making works. Nobody knows why our benefit formula is what it is, why the tax max is what it is. It's all just stuff we inherited essentially in the 1970s from people who are not in any way thinking what they were doing back then. Those
Well,
people trying to win
speak
elections, we end up with the bag.
it's 50 years ago too. Speaking of 2005, there was an attempt to offload a small portion of people's contribution into the market, right? That
Yeah,
failed.
that was the Bush proposal. I was in the White House then. I was not the main guy. I was kind of like a number cruncher type, but so I knew that stuff pretty well. I did a lot of events with President Bush around the country, which is kind of cool. It's funny when we came up on the 20th anniversary of Bush's proposal. So this would have been 2025, 20 years later. I just started thinking to myself, okay, what if his plan had passed? What would have happened? And so I build this model and I say, okay, Back then they were saying, okay, you're going to have some reductions in traditional Social Security benefits for middle and high income people. Then you'd have this personal account where you can invest part of your existing payroll tax and stocks and bonds. And the total benefit you get every time is a combination of those two. And people are speculating, well, we don't know what the stock market's going to do and so forth. But 20 years later, it's like,
Now
okay,
we do.
we've got some data. So let's just see what happened. And the results were for people retiring today. I think low and middle income people would have higher total benefits by a little bit. The very highest income people, their benefits would be down by a couple percent because the cuts to their traditional benefits will be larger than the gains they got from the personal account. But even they would be fine. It's not a big deal. Going forward, it looked that people would do a little bit better with the Bush plan than with the traditional system. But here's the important thing is the traditional system is broke. We just talked about 2032 goes broke, huge deficits. The Bush proposal, it wouldn't have made Social Security totally solvent, but it would have addressed half or two-thirds of the long-term funding gap. So you get a system that would have paid you benefits, around the same, maybe a little bit better than Social Security, but would be in much more solid financial shape. Now, today the times are different today. I don't think the personal accounts really are viable today. But the point is, if they had done something back then, everything could be easier today. But literally, the members of Congress were just too afraid. They, for Republicans, they were afraid of taking the political hit. For Democrats, it was too tempting to give the political hit. And so they knew we had to do something, but they couldn't swallow hard and say, look, let's just kind of go in on this thing together. They didn't want to give Bush the win because by that point, like Iraq was going badly. They really didn't like him. So they're like, okay, we're just going to beat this guy up. But the problem is, hey, Bush served out his term. He's happily retired in Texas. The people you really screwed were the ones who depend on Social Security because we didn't fix it. And
Yeah.
you just
And
hope that's not what we do again. But
somebody,
it's
not us, in 2045 could be having the same conversation, right? Like, if only in 2025 or 2026 we'd gotten serious. I mean, um, and I do think people mix up the trust fund with, a lot of people think all of Social Security is going to be bankrupt in 6 years versus like we're still taking in a trillion, but we just
yeah,
need
it's
a trillion 20 billion, right? Like we just need 22% more than what we're taking in.
Yeah, if you go back 20 or 25 years, there's all these arguments, the trust fund, is it
Right. Al
real? Is it
Gore,
or whatever? And that was a big debate at the time. And the
the
trust fund is
lockbox.
essentially, IOUs written from one side of the government to the other side of the government. And, I thought at the time, the trust fund is not real in an economic sense. It doesn't make it easier for the government to pay Social Security benefits. It is a pledge that we will pay them, but it doesn't make it easier to pay them. But here's the interesting thing that if having a trust fund doesn't make it easier to pay benefits, not having a trust fund doesn't make it harder. I mean, the trust fund runs out, we still have taxes coming in, we can still pay 80% of what is owed. If we retarget that, you can maintain the safety net for people. It's not like you're totally insolvent or totally broke. But it's yeah, that all these long debates over whether the trust fund is real or not get resolved because the trust fund itself could be gone in 6 years.
Yeah, we don't have to talk about it
That
anymore.
doesn't matter very much anymore. But I do hope. I mean, you said okay, people in 2045 or something. If the solution we come up with for Social Security, let's just going to borrow $500 billion a year, whatever it's going to be. People in 2045, when the federal government is bankrupt, the dollar's dropping and all these sort of financial crisis things that we think only happen to other countries. Once that happens to us, they would look back and say, wow, I wish those people were more responsible. This really is the Social Security problem. In a sense, if we went back 25, 30 years ago, it was a manageable problem. The real issue is not the demographics or the benefit growth or whatever. The real issue is just poor stewardship of this program by Congress and respective presidents. It is absolutely a governance problem. It is not a problem of these sort of economic or demographic fundamentals. All of that can be handled.
Everyone wants to be Santa Claus, right? I mean,
Sure.
no one wants to be the Grinch. So it's just
It's
with
it's very but leadership is about giving people bad news. You
that's
know
right.
good news kind of tells itself. Bad news has to be told. There
That's right.
has to be people to be convinced, okay, this is gonna hurt, but we gotta do it. and we just didn't have the willingness. I mean, President Clinton in the late '90s, he tried to do some stuff. That was, he didn't deliver much bad news because we had surpluses. President Bush was willing to tell people, okay, look, you're not going to get every penny you've been promised. Beyond that,
Hasn't
the
been good.
level of leadership has been very poor, very poor.
Hmm. All right. Well, next year when the trustees report comes out, come back and give us more bad news.
Yeah, really. Yeah, until then, things are looking up. But now it's something people want to be aware of, and so I think that's the key thing.
Well, I think the most one of the more salient things you said is that no one understands it. So people
Nobody.
are upset and arguing over something that they don't understand the mechanics of. And so I do know people who think they have an account with their name on it that their social security taxes went into, and
I
they're
have
just
some
going to
bad
start
news
taking
for
the
you.
money out.
Yeah, your taxes go into Social Security, go straight out the door to pay for your grandmother's benefits. If you want to know where your taxes are, they're in your grandmother's bank
That's right.
account.
That's right. All right,
So you
great.
go
Well,
ask
thank you
her.
so much. I appreciate the time. I really do.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be with you.